My name's Robert Schifreen. I'm a IT security person by trade. Been doing that about 25 years. Been doing SharePoint about 5 years, just over. And I work at the University of Brighton as a farm administrator. Built a SharePoint farm there over the past sort of 5 years, as I said. And please do come through. And being a programmer of old, having started off with Visual Basic and things on PCs, being a general tinkery type programmer hacker, always after doing little things to try and ease my workload and save my time and save other people's time. And then once we moved into SharePoint, as I said about 5 years ago, then obviously that's the time to get your hands dirty with things like PowerShell. And you rapidly discover just how much time PowerShell can save both you as a SharePoint admin, your support team, and so on. And that's what I really want to talk about today, some of the things that we've been doing. If you've been to Gary's sessions this morning, then you'll have heard things about commands that let you retrieve SharePoint sites, site collections, and so on, and then manipulate them. And this is some much more practical examples. Not detailed things, but just some of the things I'm doing, because what I'm doing is going to be slightly different to what you want to do. But if I give you lots of examples of what I do, I can point you hopefully in the right direction, and then you can go away and find out what you want. As I said, I work at the University of Brighton, been there about 12 years. I like to describe myself as a UVP. Lots of people you've heard from today are MVPs, most valued professionals by Microsoft, or most valuable professionals. I'm a UVP, which is an undervalued professional. And I think a lot of us here are the same thing. So welcome all the UVPs. If you want to get hold of me, anything you want to talk about, any information that you want that we haven't covered on these slides this afternoon, r.schifreen@brighton.ac.uk will get me, and you're welcome to drop me an email, or I'm also on Twitter as rschifreen. I look after two farms, the pre-production and the production share farm at the University of Brighton. We've got about 2.5 million documents in 3 production web apps. My third farm that I look after is a small holding that my wife and I have, on which we have 9 sheep, 2 emus, and we did until recently have some chickens. We've got a couple of dogs and so on. And that really is my emu in a tiara. That's when she was a guest at our wedding. Took a long time to get that photo. And despite the fact that when you see lambs in the fields nowadays and you think, aren't lambs wonderfully hardy? Because as soon as they're born, they're quite happy to be out in the fields in all weathers. They don't mind the wind and the rain. And actually, given the choice, they'd much rather be curled up on the sofa. And if their fire's on, they'd much rather be in front of the fire, which is quite depressing when you see them in the fields. But that's one of our hand-reared lambs. And she's actually wearing a nappy, a diaper if you look lower down on the photo, but I didn't include that bit. There's a saying among the sheep farming, the sheep herding community, that a sheep's main aim in life is to die, and a good shepherd prevents this as long as possible, which is absolutely true. If you don't trim the sheep's feet at the right time, they get foot rot and then they die. If they get an infection, they just lie back with their legs in the air and die. If their teeth get a bit infected or they get a bit of a hooky tooth, they just give up eating and they die. If they don't keep their back ends clean, the maggots get in there and lay eggs in their back ends and they die. And there are hundreds of things that will kill a sheep. And if you farm, not sheep, but if you farm SharePoint servers, you will know that the main aim of a SharePoint server is to die. And your job is to keep it going as long as possible and to notice when it's just about to lie down with its legs in the air and hopefully pick those legs up and give it a shot of something and stop it dying. What I want to talk about now, between now and the next 50 minutes or so, I'll try and get you away for your trains and planes as early as possible, some of the perception about SharePoint and some of the real reality and the problems I had and the way I chose to solve them. The way you might choose to solve things may well be different, but hopefully it will give you some ideas. There's 60 slides in total. We're on number 4, so we're going to whiz through about 1 a minute. You're more than welcome to take photos of any screens that interest you. As I said, we are SharePoint 2010. We are on premises, and please note that a premise is a thought, a premises is a place. So anybody who says it's on premise, there is no such thing unless they're on trend and on thought, then they can call it on premise, but there is no such thing as a premise. We are using Windows 2008 R2, and we're using SQL Server 2008 R2 because that's what was around at the time. Works perfectly well for us, but we have plans in place to upgrade to Server 2012, but that's nothing to do with me. and I go, what's our IT people say? So what's the perception of SharePoint? What's the perception that we like to give to our users and our superiors and the people who look after SharePoint and the people we look after? Pretty much that, really. It works, it's fine. If the users think they can log on, it seems to be just about working. Everything's absolutely fine. It's all going, it's all under control. And if anybody comes in to see what we're doing and we want to show them a shot of central admin, that's probably the screenshot we show them, which we've got on a screensaver so people think it's the real thing. And there's central admin, everything behaving, no warnings, no nothing. Obviously, if you're on 2013, it may be different, but that's my 2010 one, and that's my 2010 screensaver, no problem. The reality, of course, if you look after a SharePoint farm, is slightly different. Probably your central admin looks a bit more like that. I don't even know why they bother with the red bar, because everyone just ignores it. It's like adverts on web pages. If suddenly something major came up in that red bar, you wouldn't even notice. I'll wait. And the reality, of course, of being an admin is very much like this, which I found on the internet. Are you going to play? You are going to play. There are an awful lot of things you have to do when you're a SharePoint admin. It's very much like spinning plates, and I have a static screenshot from this on my office door. And there is nothing really that sums up being a SharePoint farm admin better than that. You've got all your little spinning plates that you've managed to get spinning, that you've got to occasionally just go and tweak and make sure they're carrying on spinning. At the same time, you're working on the current plate that you've done all the strategic thinking about and you know how to get it spinning, so you're starting to get that spinning. And then ahead of you are the poles that you haven't even got the plates on yet. And you're having to think, right, how am I going to do those? And the trouble is you never get round to filling those last two poles, because actually it's not just two poles, it's an awful lot of things that you've got left to do. And my to-do list is probably about 2 to 3 years worth of stuff. And then when some of it's tiny, some of it lasts a day, and everybody says, this is an hour's work, can't you just do it? Can't you just go and install this service? No, thank you very much. This is a production service, so I'm not just going to install it and see if it works, because last time I tried it, it broke something, and it took me 3 days to work out why. And every single thing you do, you have to think about the consequences, research it, and so on, and it does take a lot of time. What's nice is that on Azure, you can, if you want to test something that's quite dangerous and you don't even want to mess up your pre-production farm, just spin up a new farm on Azure, install SharePoint, the whole lot on it, test it, see if it works, knock it down again, log off, spin down the machines, cost you about 10 quid. It's brilliant. Other cloud-based services are no doubt available, but Azure gives lots of them away for free, so you might as well use those. A bit about us at the university. Apart from the sheep farm, that's nothing to do with the university, that's our architecture at the moment. Pre-production farm and the production farm on here. Layer 1 is the front-end web server. There's a PHP helper server, which is something I learnt from the people who run our student intranet, which is a big Blackboard thing. Because I'm a PHP expert, because I'm a PHP user and programmer with a bit more experience actually than even SharePoint, one of the things I did is I set up a separate PHP server running PHP, IIS, could have been Apache, could even have been Linux if I wanted, so that if I want to do little tweaky things, web-related things that suck stuff off SharePoint screens or whatever, or do little web programming things, and they're best done at the server level outside of SharePoint in something like Perl or PHP. I've got a PHP server at my disposal, which actually came in very useful for something that I'll talk about later on. There's also a spare web server on there, which one of the things that somebody said to me is, our farm's not very resilient, can you make it resilient? And I said, yes, of course I can, I'll just do that on Tuesday afternoon between lunch and dinner. And then while I was doing the research, they said, actually, that's not your area anymore, that's the IT people, so forget about it. So I have a spare server. So yes, we have a single point of failure in our web server, which unfortunately is not up to me to do anything about at the moment. Our second layer, application servers, 3 more SharePoint servers running everything but web services. Can't can't read that screen. Let's try that one. That one mostly does the search crawls. That one mostly does Mahimbi, who were here in the exhibitors hall, which does our PDF conversion. It's a SharePoint server also running Mahimbi and a copy of Office, and what that means is somebody in a document library can right-click on a document, say convert to PDF, and then Mahimbi converts it to PDF, which is quite handy for our committees because people can just upload documents and then it PDFs them, so the committees can have that. This one does all my little fancy SharePoint PowerShell type scripts, which I'll show you later on. This one, which is actually in the production farm but is used for pre-production and production, runs my network monitor software, which I'll show you shortly. Most of these are, well, the main web server for 4,000 odd users and 2 terabytes of data is 16 gig and 4 CPUs. The application servers are 8 gig and 2. Some of them is even 8 gig and 1. I work quite closely with our VM. We're all on VMware, and I work closely with our VMware guy, and we sort of dynamically tweak those. We'll look at the stats over the course of a week or two, see what the performance is. If something's running a bit hot, then we'll give it another processor or a bit more memory or whatever, and if it doesn't need it, then we'll take it away and use it somewhere else. Incidentally, if you've got access to vSphere, or your VM guys have got access to vSphere and Hyper-V thing, and you look at the stats of how much memory and disk and CPU something's using at the VM host level, it is very different to what's being used at the Windows OS level. So go on your figures at the Windows OS level, not the VM level, and you'll find out more detailed information. That's our database server, 32 gigs, 2 CPUs. I know the books say 16, but 2 CPUs is plenty, because in virtual stuff, the more CPUs you give it, the more time the host sits waiting for all those CPUs to become available. Much better to say to it, go ahead with 2, rather than wait for 8 or wait for 16, and that does us just fine. 32 gig is okay, 64 would be nice. I need to go and pull in some more favors. That's just a file server with, that we use for backups. I'll talk about backups later on. And that's a very nice 48 terabyte NAS that we bought because I wasn't happy with the way that NetBackup was doing our corporate backups. So we hid a little NAS in the data center and we do it in our own way. Current server architecture, when you look at that, you think, that's easy, that's what the books say. That took quite a few weeks to come up with that. Not helped by the fact that our senior IT people who come from either the libraries faculty or the arts faculty that's the university, that's higher education for you, made the decision to buy SharePoint 2010 before it had even been launched. So the first thing you do is you go onto Amazon and you say, show me a 2010 SharePoint book, of which there are now thousands, most of which are of course obsolete because we're on 13. There was not one when we made the decision to buy it. I love senior management. That's our fairly similar layout pre-production farm. Just about everything we want to do on tests we do in pre-production. Because the pre-production SharePoint is in the same domain, we only have one production domain as the production farm. The only things I can't test in there are things that mess up domain stuff, like syncing with AD, because obviously you don't want to mess up AD. So for that, we have a separate test domain, but I generally don't look after that too much. And this is according to Gliffy, which is where I do my diagrams. I don't use Visio, I use an online thing called Gliffy, which is great, and it's free. That's revision 142, so you can see how long it's gone. And it's very important that I keep that up to date, because that keeps me up to date with how much disk space I've got on each machine and so on. We have 3 production web apps. The general guidance that you'll be told is about 5, 6, 7 web apps is where you start to push it. We've got 3 production ones. A staff intranet called Staff Central, my sites, personal sites, which every staff member has. We've got about 4,500 staff. Students aren't on SharePoint yet, but they will be at some point. We use Blackboard, if anyone's familiar with that, as our student virtual learning environment. It's called VLE, and at some point we'll probably replace the portal front-endy bit of that with SharePoint, but keep all the educational bit in Blackboard, because there's an awful lot of feeds from various places, and it's all very, very fiddly. Staff Central was going to be an intranet, and then, of course, 3 days after we launched it, and every department's got an area on Staff Central to publish information to the rest of the university. So the payroll department will publish salary scales to the rest of the university via Staff Central. The IT department will publish departmental policies about network security, and so on. There's a good few thousand documents on there. committees, decisions, all that sort of things. And of course, you set up what you think is going to be an intranet, and then 3 days after launch, one department says, oh, we need this available externally to the wider world. Can you turn on anonymous access, please? And you say, okay, not really, because I haven't done the research. None of the thinking and none of the planning I did ever involved this being available to the world. And of course, then the Vice-Chancellor says, well, you've got to do it, so we do it, and it works, and we have to keep a very close eye on it, but it would have been nice if somebody said to me from the start, please, could you plan us an extranet and not an intranet? But that's the way we go. You see a lot of books on SharePoint and a lot of forum postings from SharePoint when people say, I've got a problem with my content database. And the first thing you say is, why have you got a content database? I bet it's called WSS content as well. That's what it comes out of the book as, out of the box. We have one database per site collection, and we have one site collection per department or school or faculty or whatever. Again, one of the things we spent a lot of time thinking about, not helped by the lack of documentation at the time, was do we have one web app, for example, for the intranet, and then a site collection per department? Or do we have one web app for the whole of SharePoint in the university, and a site collection called intranet, a site collection called whatever, and a site collection called whatever, and then within the intranet site collection, you could have one sub-site per department or whatever. And then when you start looking at the stats and the limits and things like 200 or 300 gig in a database per site collection, and site collections can't span databases, and the way it's easy or not to set permissions across different sites and whatever, you start to realize that actually the best way to do it is to have the intranet in a separate web app. Keeps things nice and simple. So we have one site collection per department. In my sites, personal storage of 5 gig. If people want more, they can have it. In terms of everything, don't forget a my site, a personal site, is a site collection. So in theory, every user is a site collection admin on their own my site, and they can do an awful lot more. They can create blogs and wikis and everything like that. We've hidden all that for now. Of course, you can't hide it simply by giving people no permission to do it, because they're a site collection admin, so they can give themselves permission back. So we just use some CSS and some custom CSS hidden in a content editor web part, and we hide all the links, and a handful of IT people have found them, and then when they phone up and say, I've done a blog and it doesn't quite work, we say, tough, you shouldn't have done it, we don't support that. It just about works. My department, so my sites are personal sites, which a lot of people say, the last thing you should ever do in SharePoint, because not everybody needs it, is my sites. It's not the big driver. Actually, for us, the big driver was my sites, because people had all their stuff on their network drive or their C drive. They couldn't access it from off campus. And what SharePoint means is they can access it from on campus. Because although you have to authenticate, and although you have to go in through our AD and through our AD, we do let people then log on, because it comes through the firewall and people can log on to SharePoint from outside, and they love it. And we've got clients on iPods and iPhones and iPads and Android devices and everything, so users can access SharePoint from wherever they happen to be. On Android, I can't remember what we use, Share Plus, I think there's something that's called. Might be on the Mac as well. That's generally something we use at the moment. It's quite good, which is a client that lets you do things on and access SharePoint in your libraries from a mobile device. Harmony also, harmon.ie, we're outside. Their product is also very good as well, but it's not quite in our budget for thousands of users, but certain people get Harmony as well. My department, each department gets a 200 gig quota. On the service that my department replaced, they used to get 80 gigs, so they're quite happy with 200. Again, this was a sort of storage management limitation type thing. I knew how much space I got. I gave the amount I wanted to give to people. If anybody wants more, they're more than happy to come and give it to us, but they're more than happy to come and ask us, and we'll give it to them. But we don't just want to set no quotas at all, because suddenly you wake up one morning and find out someone's put the entire contents of their video collection in SharePoint, and your servers are full and everything's ground to a halt. So even if they're big, make sure you set quotas, and then at least it stops you running out of space in various places. Our SQL content databases, in my sites we've got 200, labelled my site 1 to my site 200, P for production, PP for pre-production. We worked out based on how many MySites we were going to get and if they all filled their 5 gig, and we didn't want the databases to be huge because when you're moving them from one database server to another or you're backing them up or whatever, you don't want to be messing around with 500 gig files. So it averages about 30 or so gig in each database, and there's about 40 sites in each database, and that's just nicely manageable. My department and Staff Central, 1 database per site collection on each web app. So the personnel department in my department will have a database called My Department HR, and in Staff Central they'll have one called Staff Central HR. So nicely named databases without GUIDs, as you will see in a moment. The way we've done it, and again, your mileage may vary, but the way we've done it is we use the simple recovery model everywhere. If you go to some of the other presentations that you'll have heard this week, they'll say, do not use simple recovery model anywhere. If you don't know what that means, then go and look it up. I haven't got a huge amount of time now. If you use the more complex recovery models in SQL Server, it means if something breaks, you can restore from a backup on SQL Server, and you can say, actually, I'd quite like to restore to 11:39 and 14 seconds on Tuesday the 9th, and it will do it for you. The trouble is, in order to do that, you've got to go through all these log files you archived, restore them backwards in the right order. And frankly, if we have a disaster, we haven't got time to do all that. We'd much rather get stuff going and get it restored. And if that means we can only do 1 backup a day, then that's fine. It's more than most users do anyway. So that's the decision we took. The chances of us having a disaster is pretty slim. You would not believe what we pay for a terabyte of usable disk space, about 8,000 quid. By the time you take account the RAID overhead, the fact we've got 2 data centers and they're mirrored, each data center's got a SAN and that's mirrored. Wasn't my choice, hey-ho. But to a certain extent, that is our ongoing backup, our VM infrastructure. And time to recovery is more important than us than recovery point objective, as it's called. We have about 290 databases. So we tend to use simple recovery model. As I said, use what you like, but as in everything you hear about SharePoint, go away and research, find out if it's good for you or not. Here's an extract from SQL Server Management Studio. Here's some of our databases, not a GUID Insight or a GUID Insight, all nicely created. Production MySite databases, my departments. That's the SharePoint team. Who else have we got? SharePoint training, Student Union. That's where we do our templates. University of Brighton in Hastings, that's our Hastings campus. School of Nursing and Midwifery. School of, oh, that's actually one of our internal sites, Science and Engineering, and so on. All nicely done. School of something and Service Management, I keep forgetting, and so on. You cannot, when you create a site collection, if you want to give it a nice friendly database name, you have to create the site collection in PowerShell. There's no option in the GUI, at least there wasn't in 2010, to create a site collection with a friendly database name unless you go through PowerShell. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Although interesting is SQL Server still can't sort numbers properly, and you get it in a very strange order, so you think your database is missing, but there you go. For our backups, we do a full backup every week and a differential backup every other day apart from the Friday afternoon. So the full backup starts on Friday afternoon, doesn't tend to finish till about Sunday, and then from Monday onwards we do a differential backup, only takes half an hour or so, and all those get shipped off to that separate file server I showed you, and then from there it gets shipped off to the NAS. And that's the way I do backups. In theory, what we should be doing is the corporate backup solution, which is done by the IT guys upstairs, and it gets picked up by Symantec Backup, and it backs it up nicely. And if somebody comes to me and says, I want xyz.docx from Tuesday, I can just drill down into a database backup, get that file, and ship it back to them. It doesn't work. They've been promising it for 5 years. It doesn't work, so I just do it via the NAS myself, and it works very well. But we have some consultants coming in on Friday, and they're going to make it work for us. They promised. As I said, we've got about 2 terabytes of database at the minute and about 2.5 million documents, and that's in a couple of years. So it's certainly not underused as our SharePoint. It's much appreciated. So, the last thing we need is, we thought we were going to have to go out to people and say, who wants to be a guinea pig for our SharePoint? Who wants to come and test it? They're knocking on our door all the time, which is great. It would be nice if I had a department of 12 people being able to develop stuff for people and build sites and all that sort of things. The technical department of SharePoint at the university is me 4 days a week, that's it. On the other side, on the user training side, on the user support, on the creating sites for people and whatever, there's about 5 or 6 people. But on the technical side, because the senior management don't think that's terribly important, there's 1 person 4 days a week. But that is going to change. I know it is because they promised. The first thing you'll need if you want to be a farm admin, even if you've got admin access to all your servers and root access to your servers, and you're a SharePoint farm admin, and you're a SQL Server admin, you will still need to call in an awful lot of favors. Because these are all the things I can't do, despite the fact that I have an awful lot of power within SharePoint. These are all the things I can't do, apart from the one with the tick, because I suddenly realized I actually can. But if I want a new server, or I want the SAN messed about with, or I want DNS entries added, or firewall holes, or set up the AD sync from the AD side of things, or I want AD groups created, and the logon scripts done for all users to map their drive to SharePoint, and if I need hypervisor access to be able to restart VMs at the lower level, I can't give myself that. I can't do all this sort of stuff. That's looked after by the people. So make sure you keep in nicely with all your IT guys and your server guys, because those are the sorts of favors you'll need to call in on a regular basis. Some of the most useful powers I have, and these are the things that you don't realize you need until it's too late and you think, God, I wish I had that. Make sure you've got backend access to vSphere or Hyper-V so that you can create snapshots. Then if you're going to do any work on the servers, anything from installing a service pack to doing some serious work on the server, you can create a snapshot first, do the work. If it doesn't quite work, you can roll back to the snapshot. But for that, you need access to it on your virtual server hardware if that's where you have your servers rather than physical servers. All our servers are virtual, have been from day one, including the SQL database, works fine. Plenty of people say not ideal, and chances are if we had the money, we'd probably go elsewhere and do it in a different way, but it all works absolutely fine. It does mean you can play around with the specs quite easily and work out what works best for you. Again, if you haven't got hypervisor access, you can't restart a blue-screened server because you don't see the server until it's booted Windows, and if it's blue-screened, you don't see it. So that's quite important. And again, I also have permission via our user management system to create new domain users. Again, that's very important to me. And finally, if you have machines in a Windows domain, one of the things that Windows domains do is they talk among themselves about once a month, and they say, here's your new domain password, don't tell anybody, and let's just have a quick share of things to make sure that all these machines are securely on the domain and aren't going to break and aren't going to lose trust in everybody. And what happened to me the other week is that I had a server offline, snapshotted for maintenance. It was off for half the evening while I did some work. The work didn't work, so I thought, no problem, go back to the snapshot. Went back to the snapshot. In that half an evening while I was doing the work, that's the time of the month when Windows Domain said to itself, let's go and check in with all the servers and give them a new password. And so when I brought my server back up from its snapshot, it couldn't connect to the domain, and the server was completely useless because it was now no longer a member of the domain. And if you Google it, it says, oh, that's dead easy. Take it out of the domain, put it back in again. I didn't have permission to do that. Now I do. So these are the sort of things that you don't know you need them until you suddenly do. One permission I still need, what I can't see, is the native hard disks on the virtual hosts. And the reason I need to see that is because if you don't know how snapshots work when you create snapshots in virtual environments, it doesn't create a snapshot of the entire drive. All it does is it creates a very tiny little log file, and then every time something happens on that computer, it writes it to disk, and it writes a record in that log file. And that log file is basically just a big undo file. So if you say, I don't like this stuff, I want to go back to the snapshot, it simply uses that snapshot as a script to reverse everything you've done in the time you were doing the work. And those snapshots can be multi-gigabytes, they can be quite big, and they take an awful long time to delete, because imagine trying to delete the log file while the drive is still spinning, it's quite difficult. You have no idea how big those log files, those snapshot files are going to get while you're doing your work. But suffice it to say, if you're installing a gig of service packs, that snapshot file is going to hit a gigabyte quite quickly, and it can be an awful lot more. And at some point, it may well be that the snapshot file fills up the physical disk it's on. And if that physical disk it's on is also used to hold other VMs, not only will your VM crash, so will all those other VMs as well. So anyone who says to you, VMs are great, you can't kill one VM from another, absolutely wrong. I had some lovely late night phone calls with my manager over that one. Both screaming at each other saying it's your fault. One more little thing I want to show you before we start looking at some PowerShell. In the previous presentation, for anyone who was here, you'll notice that Thomas was talking about his SP admin account. And the reason he uses SP admin for his farm admin is because whenever you look in all the books, it says, first thing you do is you set up your SP admin account, or SP_farm. If you've got your farm admin account called SP admin or SP_farm, bear that in mind for a second. If you've got your security hat on, and you've got account lockout set on your servers, such that if somebody gets a password wrong X number of times, it locks them out for X number of minutes, think about that for a second as well on the other side. So now we've got a known username, spfarm, spadmin, and we've got lockout. In this particular case, 3 minutes of downtime if somebody gets the password wrong 3 times. 10's a better example, but I couldn't find that screenshot on Google. So if I walk up to your farm, and I don't even have to be on your premises, I can simply try to get into your SharePoint system over the internet, and I don't even have to know a password. All I do is I try to log in as spfarm and get the password wrong 3 times. Your farm admin account's now locked out. Pick a random SharePoint server on the internet, go and search Google for SharePoint, find a login screen. Type in spfarm, spadmin, log in half dozen times, the account gets locked out, hey presto, your farm's down. Easy as that. So that's why you don't use spfarm or spadmin as your farm account in SharePoint. Or at least you shouldn't. I'm sure I'm not the first person to discover that, but I did discover that. And that was quite a bit of a panicky half hour, because our lockout's set to 30 minutes, not 3. That was a bit of a panic that time. I did phone Microsoft, I did report it. They said, oh, thank you, we'll pass it on. A bit like Asda do when you report a dodgy can of beans, and I didn't hear from either. Yeah. Good. Good. Keep it separate. Absolutely. As long as you're aware of the problem, you can do something about it. Yeah, fine. I mean, if you look at me, when I started setting up SharePoint, I went to our IT people and said, can I have 20 user accounts, please? All random names, all look completely innocuous. If you saw them written down, you wouldn't know what they do. Some of them are farm admin, some of them do nothing at all, some of them are just for my support staff to mess around with for testing and have no powers really at all. You would not know. If you want to call your farm admin something, call it John Smith. And if you see a J.Smith account lying around somewhere, nobody for a moment thinks that's the farm admin.
I think you've answered the question. So I was going to say, what did you call it? And I thought, well, you're not going to answer that question.
To be honest, what I did, I set up a load of accounts called SharePoint 1 to SharePoint 30. And some of them are farm admin, some of them aren't, some of them do all sorts of things. There's a couple of other accounts with similar sort of batches of names, that's what I do. But I could just as easily have called it John Smith or Jane Doe or anything I wanted. Only I need to know that it's called SharePoint. Also, because these things have a habit of turning up in search if you're not careful in people search. And then in people search, you've got a thing saying SharePoint farm admin. So again, if it's just an innocuous sounding name, so much better. SharePoint, of course, loves PowerShell. And PowerShell loves SharePoint. They go very well together. There's 700 and something odd commands in PowerShell just for manipulating SharePoint things. So let me show you some of the things that you can do to save your time in PowerShell. My golden rule, when you find yourself doing something for the second or third time, go back and script it in PowerShell instead. Sometimes it will set you back a couple of weeks. It's well worth it, trust me. Of course, PowerShell does have its quirks. Presumably from the days when SharePoint was not as well known as it was, the terminology is slightly different. In SharePoint, through the GUI and through the books and everything, we know SharePoint consisting of 3 levels of hierarchy: web apps, site collections, and sites or subsites. To PowerShell, these are known as Web applications, fine. A site collection is actually known as a site in PowerShell, and a site or a subsite is actually known as a web in PowerShell. So again, if you were at Gary's session this morning, you'll have noticed him getting an object that was, for example, a site to work on, and the command in PowerShell to get a site is get-sp web. To get a site collection, it's get-sp site. So you can say, for example, x equals get-sp web, and then a URL, and then you can say x.url, x.something, and look at all its objects and all its properties and all its characteristics and so on. But that's PowerShell terminology, which is worth knowing, because that will trip you up. It still trips me up occasionally. And the first things first, before you start doing anything SharePoint admin-wise, and I'm very, very sort of retentive, anal about this, keep a log of everything you do, because that tells you how to build your time machine if it goes wrong. This is an example from my real log. My OneNote file of all my important notes in SharePoint runs to about 500 and something pages. This is my change log from the production server. So everything you do, make a note of the date and what you did. And then if you suddenly think, oh, SharePoint seems to have broken from the logs at 5:15 on Tuesday, you look at Tuesday and you see what you did. And more than once that has saved me, because I know exactly why it broke. I can go back and fix it. I use OneNote. Use whatever sort you like. If you've got an important changelog, an important documentation, important system documentation on how to fix SharePoint, don't keep it on SharePoint. Again, we had an example where we had a big network outage in our IT department at the university, and the definitive guide for fixing it was on the IT wiki, and one of the services that had gone down was the IT wiki. I mentioned that one of my servers runs a thing called PRTG network monitor. Obviously, my favorite phrase from my years editing a magazine called Software Management is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And it's true for SharePoint just as much as pretty much anything else. You need some sort of eye into your SharePoint servers. And by all means, get Microsoft's big network operations center type thing, and by all means have half a dozen people staring at enormous screens in a room like this, and they've actually got BBC News on one of the machines in the corner, and they're mostly watching that rather than the little dials. But have something. If you haven't got a whole team to look after something, you just need one screen. And I did a bit of research, and my favorite product for looking after a load of servers and just seeing what's going on is something called PRTG from a company in Germany called Paesler, P-A-E-S-S-L-E-R. I was, until very recently, a paying customer of theirs. And the reason I'm no longer a paying customer of theirs is because when you buy PRTG, as it's called, each of these little squares is a sensor. And the license fee you pay depends on how many sensors you want. And until recently, if you wanted 100 sensors, it was $440 one off and then about 20% a year. As of last week, the 100 sensor version is now free. And it's dead good. I don't get paid by them, although they did send me a very nice German beer mug, but I've had nothing else off them. So you simply point this at your servers, and I can see my CPU load, my free memory, orange if it's below the 25% threshold, unless you change it, red if it's got a bit of a problem. That's got a bit of a problem because I've got a firewall hole that needs opening. I know about that. I'm down to 100 odd gig on my main database drive, but I know about that. I've got a 3 terabyte drive there waiting for me to move stuff onto once I can set some downtime going. You can create if you don't like any of, and also you've even got sensors for SSL expires. So this shows me how many days till all my SSL certs expire. And my site, so HTTPS, mysite.brighton.ac.uk expires in 63 days. So I know, because often you find that you don't renew those in time and your sites break, so it will even tell me things like that. You can create your own sensors for PRTG in PowerShell or just about anything else, even as exe files. Here's one I did. Whenever SQL, this is my SQL server, whenever SQL crashes and has an error, it creates what's called a mini-dump file and sticks it in a certain directory. So all you've got to do is count the number of files in that directory, and if it's non-zero, you know that SQL's had a bit of a problem. And that's all that server does. That's all that sensor does. There is a built-in sensor that says count the number of files in this directory. tell me if it's non-zero. If it is, and if there's a mini dump in there, SQL Server's gone wrong, and it knows I know about it, so I just keep an eye on this. There's a mobile device client for this as well, so you can look at it on your phone. Here's a sensor I wrote, HIDS events. HIDS is a host-based intrusion detection server. It's late in the day. You can buy HIDS-based devices. It all comes under security incident and event management or something, SIEM. And again, you can sit and watch all these failed password attempts go past if you've got endless time. If you haven't, here's my little homemade mini HIDS server, which is about 20 lines of PowerShell that I wrote from scratch, and I'll show it to you very shortly. It presents itself as a sensor within PRTG, and I can see that over the time that it's been logged, I've got 2 events which are suspicious, except they're not because I faked them for the purpose of this. If you click on any of those sensors in PRTG, it shows you what's going on. So you've got your graph you can have over 1, 2, 3 days, 2 years, whatever you like, which in the case of disk space is really good because you can see how quickly it's going down and work out when you're going to run out completely. In this particular case, my HIDS has said I've got two alerts. Here it is. 2 people, 3 people actually, because it updated in the time I did this thing. Have logged in as administrator, or attempted to, from that particular PC. That's all I need to know, really. Not logged in, they've tried to log in and failed because they had the wrong password. So I immediately know that 2 or 3 people on this particular machine, which happens to be mine, have attempted to log in as administrator. So I can go and knock on their door and say, why are you trying to log into SharePoint or my servers as admin? Which is a really useful feature. If nothing else, as long as that sensor is 0, it gives the peace of mind to know that someone's not trying to hack your boxes. The way it does that, and I'll show you the code in a sec, is it looks at the Windows event log, because every time someone tries to log in and gets their password wrong, there's an entry in the Windows event log, and you can just pull that out with PowerShell. All the information from the SharePoint error log doesn't go into a Windows error log, but if you want it to, there is a product called Logbinder. And what that will do is it will add all the SharePoint error log stuff into the Windows error log, so you've got everything in one place. Here's the HIDS code, a bit of PowerShell. I've cut it a bit slightly to make it all fit on one screen, but really there are half a dozen or so event codes in the Windows event log that are of interest. In our particular case, it is 4625, I think, which is 4625. So these are some of the other ones you may want to add, but I wanted to keep it fairly short. But all I really care about is Windows event 4625, which says someone tried to log in and got the password wrong. That'll do me. And within that Windows event log, it tells me what they tried to log in as, where they came in from, and the date and time. That'll do me nicely, thank you very much. So, bit of PowerShell, get the Windows event log from which computer, whichever server this sensor's coming from. I pass it as a parameter in the code for the sensor from PRTG. And then if you want to pass some parameters to it, you use a filter hash table, which you have to do if you want to get quite clever about it. You want to pass more than one parameter. So in my Windows event log, I want the security event log. I'm looking for ID 4625. If you want any more of these, you just do this, comma, that, comma, that, comma. You can look for dozens of them. Starting from a particular time, I've got to start, because I've got a time set early, which I haven't shown you here. Because I'm only going to look back about 4 hours or so, because if you start looking back for hours and days, then it takes an awful long time. And then something else you'll see quite often in PowerShell, error action, silently continue. If there's an error, just carry on, don't crash. So once I've got our big array of objects and events, I can count how many there are, because I need to know how many there are. And then for each event in this array of events, pass the information. You can find that out on Google, how to get from the XML of the event array that came in. You can find out that field 13 is the workstation name that this came from. In the particular case of event 4625, that's the target username. And then what I say is, again, from what you were saying about I've got accounts that start with portal or SharePoint or whatever, or admin, if this username starts with portal, or it starts with PRL, which is another batch of my accounts, or it starts with admin, or it starts with guest, because I want to see if someone's trying to log in as guest, increment the score, and add to my message this username came from that workstation. Construct my message, and then output as PRTG says, write host sends output on from PowerShell. So I'm sending my XML in my PRTG output in XML format, specifying what the score was, how many hits there were, setting it to orange for a warning. That's all the output you have to do to make a valid PRTG sensor, and there you are, you've got yourself a custom sensor. And that's a very cut down junior HIDS system in 30 or so lines of PowerShell. Something else to talk about, external users. What do you do if, in our case, external examiners, members of the board of governors, people that we're collaborating with outside of the university come to you and say, I want to use SharePoint? Or what if a department in the university comes to us and says, I'd quite like to collaborate with a business partnership with that factory down the road. Can they use SharePoint, please? And of course, there are plenty of people who will sell you extranet solutions, which means that as well as having your AD-based database of SharePoint users, you can have a separate little extranet directory, so people can then log in with their Gmail account or their Hotmail account or whatever and use your SharePoint, because all the consultants say you don't really want to have external users like examiners and whatever in your AD. You probably don't, but also you don't really want to have a separate database of people outside of your main AD, because now you've got two databases of users to look after, two things to keep hackers away from, two areas of the university or the department or the company that's now got Data Protection Act responsibilities for keeping that data safe. So it's a bit of a toss-up. You know, the standard answer for everything in SharePoint is it depends. So don't assume that because people say don't do it that way, you shouldn't do it that way. What we did is we set up a separate area in our AD. We gave these people a user type that says that what they can do is they can log into SharePoint, but they can't do anything else. They can't walk in off the street and log into one of our PCs, but they can log into SharePoint, and that means we can then put them in our AD. That's the way we currently do it. I am facing pressure to have a separate extranet product so people can log in with their Facebook accounts and whatever. A couple of leading ones, one of which is called Extradium. It's very nice, it works very well. For 200 users or less, I think it's free, but it's overkill. I'm trying not to have to go down that route. What I did do is I put together half a dozen lines of PHP. Again, let's talk about my PHP helper server. This is why it was very useful. I've got half a dozen lines of PHP that pull in from our AD and our LDAP, all the people who have got this external user type in LDAP and Active Directory, so I can see who these external users are in our AD, who can log into SharePoint but nothing else, and who created that external account and when it's due to expire. Of course, if you have a separate extranet database of users for logging into SharePoint, that's all they can log into. So when somebody says, oh, can this external examiner, can this external caterer log into so-and-so system, you have to say, no, you can't, unless it's on SharePoint. So again, that's another reason why you really want everything in one place. There's a good reason why people like everything in one place. And if anybody knows PHP, then again, very quick bit of PHP that in this case binds to our LDAP, because we've got LDAP and AD, and they talk to each other because we've got certain systems that can't talk to AD and some that can't talk to LDAP, and you simply do a quick search in AD. That's the user type we're looking for. It's an XP. Don't ask me why it's called XP. I don't look after our LDAP. And you just search LDAP for anybody whose user type is that, and dump it in a table, and dump it with their username, their real name, the date they were added, and the creator and the expiry date, and dump it into an HTML table. Quite fiddly to create an HTML table in PHP, but it can be done much easier in PowerShell. I'll show you that shortly. So again, little hacky things, brilliant to do. Well worth the time spent and invested in putting these sort of things together. One of our very most useful first-line troubleshooting tools is this. This is a web page that runs to about 6,000 lines. I've only shown you the first 50 or so because the screen's not that big. This is a report that gets created every night by some PowerShell of mine. I'll show you shortly. So for all the My Sites, we've got the URL of the My Site, the name of the person, what content database they're in, and how many megabytes of space they've used in their 5 gig My Site. Some people go over 5 gig because, of course, if you map a drive, it's not a real drive. Windows doesn't know how big the drive really is, and you can go over your quota. If you go through the web interface, you can't. If you go through a map drive, you can. All very interesting how Microsoft handles it. And here's the quota. It's not rounded very well, but that's Windows for you again. But a 4.9 gig, 5 gig quota, and a handful of people have had it increased to 10 gig. So if somebody phones us up and says, I haven't got a My Site, we can say, yes, you have, it's there. If they say, my My Site looks like it's full, we can say, yes, it is, we'll give you some more space. If I need to restore a file from a backup, I know which content database to go in to get that thing. So that's all really useful, and that just runs via a PowerShell script. Windows scheduled task every day produces that as an HTML file. It could produce it by dumping it to a SharePoint list, but I only recently thought of that, and my life's busy enough as it is. But then you can set permissions to it and whatever. But this just dumps it to a HTML file on my PHP helper server. And here is pretty much all the SharePoint code that produces that list, the PowerShell code that produces that list. First thing you have to know with PowerShell, don't forget to add the PowerShell snap-in for SharePoint in your script. If you don't, all the SharePoint-related commands won't be there. If you run a PowerShell script through the integrated IDE, then it puts that in for you. If you run through the management shell, it puts it in for you. If you run it through the IDE or you run it just from a command line, it won't put it in for you, so make sure you do. That's a good reason why if you run a PowerShell script through a Windows scheduled task, it'll often fail to run because you haven't done that. The other reason that often a Windows scheduled task fails to run a PowerShell script is because you put blah, blah, blah.ps1 as the scheduled task. That won't work either. As you'll know, if you double-click on a PowerShell file, it doesn't run the PowerShell, it opens Notepad. So if you put blah, blah, blah.ps1 as a Windows scheduled task, all you'll find that happens at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're in bed is your machine is nicely opening Notepad for you. So you have to run PowerShell.exe / file name equals blah, blah, blah. You can find it on the internet. So here's my code. Set my HTML styles. Here is a bit of code I found off the internet from Gary LaPointe, who was speaking earlier today. You can, if you want, create some very horrible, very long PowerShell queries. This is one of them. So get SP site. So we're getting a site collection. Specify which web application I'm using, my sites, and I'm getting the root web, I'm getting the content database name, I'm getting formatted in the way I want it, the amount of storage being used, and so on. I talked about how difficult it is in PHP to create an HTML file and a nice HTML table. When you get data in PowerShell, just put convert to HTML on the end, specify a file name, and it dumps it for you as an HTML table, as easy as that. And there are some little known things in the convert to HTML thing. -head will then put this particular $S. It'll put this particular HTML code in the header of the HTML, so you can set your styles. And -body, $B will then put that in the body of your HTML, so you can set your styles, you can set your headers and so on in the HTML that PowerShell produces. Now we're going, so speed up a little. We've got about 10 minutes to go at the most. How we handle my site creation. What we didn't want to do is to turn on automatic My Site and self-service My Site creation so anybody who wants a My Site can click a button. Because at the moment we don't want students to have My Sites, but we want staff to have them. And even then, not all the staff. So what we do is we turned off self-service site creation, and I have a PowerShell script which runs about 4 times a day. And what it does is, if anybody new has arrived in Active Directory, i.e. we've got some new joiners, if their user account type is staff rather than student, and if their user account isn't disabled, and if they don't already have a My Site, we create one for them. Easy as that. You can actually create a My Site for somebody in PowerShell in 1 line. However, the trouble with My Sites by default is they don't work the way you want, almost certainly. They're all completely open. Everything in a My Site is shared. You've got libraries for things you probably don't want, like public files and public videos and public pictures and all that sort of stuff. What we wanted was everything private, and we wanted better named stuff. So my script doesn't just create the My Site, it tweaks an awful lot of things. The only thing to remember is if you've dismounted a content database for maintenance, don't let this script run, because when it starts looking for people who haven't already got a My Site, there'll be loads of them because you've dismounted a database. And then when you try to put the database back, you then get lots of duplicate My Sites, which is a complete pain. One of the things we do, we've got 2 or 3 custom fields added to AD, which I import and I sync into the SharePoint AD sync. So we've got these fields which I added. So the user account control AD feature gives me a bitmapped representation of the user's privileges on their account. So 66080 is normally means it's an enabled account. 66082 normally if it's disabled. Personal or functional, we have functional accounts for departmental things that aren't tied to a person. And we know if, from extension attribute 3, we know if they're staff or student, which I need to know for my script. This is the output that my script produces. Again, this is a very key troubleshooting tool. It reads from bottom to top. So this typically is a typical run. It ran 10:55, finished at 11:21, so about 25 minutes. First thing it does is it looks for My Sites to create for new people. It found one. That was that. Then the second stage, it goes around customizing any of the My Sites it needs to customize because they're still the out-of-the-box version. So it'll set the portal URL to say what the root site is. It will set the list view threshold. It will create a mobile navigation list. I talked earlier about Share Plus. Share Plus, which is the mobile client for SharePoint from, I can't remember the name, they keep changing. That works because there needs to be a list in each site collection that says which libraries it shows and which ones it doesn't. So the first thing my script does in the My Site, it creates that list. I'll show you how you do it in a minute. Disables email notifications because we don't need that. Disable the quick launch, set the site logo to be what it is, hide a particular library, hide this library, hide that library, set the alternate CSS so we can customize the look and feel of a site in CSS. Set picture URL, I'll talk about that in a moment, and that's my main thing to be done. Add contrib permissions to all sorts of stuff. So that's all the things we can customize. That's all the sorts of things you can do behind the scenes in PowerShell without having to then do it manually. It just does it. So stage 1 of my script, that's it in its entirety. Look through every user profile. I'm not going to go through it in detail because we're a bit short of time. Do a bit of binary manipulation on that 66082, check if the account's disabled or not, and then if the personal site for that user is equal to null, i.e. they haven't got one, and if the account disabled is equal to no, and if they are a user type of staff, and as long as it doesn't start with portal, because that's one of my batch accounts for doing stuff, and if they haven't got a personal site, profile.personal site equals null. Oh, I'm checking that twice. That's interesting. $profile, that's the user, .create personal site. That's all it takes to actually create a My Site in PowerShell, one line. But then you can start tweaking it. So some of the things I tweak, whiz quick through. You can set and confirm a list view threshold. We set it to 15,000 with a warning level of 10. Does everyone know about list view thresholds? List view thresholds, yeah? So we set those centrally. I know Microsoft says don't set it above 5,000. We did some work, works perfectly fine for what we use at 15,000, so we did. Much easier than having to find a way around it, and much easier than having to train users not to have hundreds of files in their folder. We still have to whack a few on the head occasionally, but we do set it to 15,000, and that's how we do that. We can put back the admin account because don't forget every My Site user is a site collection admin. So if they've locked us out, we put it back. Again, you can do that. This is creating that mobile navigation list I talked to you about for Share Plus. So if you want to create a list item and a list, SharePoint will do that for you. Get the particular subsite .list, so that's the collection of lists in that subsite, and then you add, and you can add the title, you can have a description, which template you want, and that's one line to create a list, and then you can start creating list items. It's as easy as that again in PowerShell. I don't need to go into huge detail, you might as well look it up. Again, if you want to hide a library so it doesn't show up in the web client, doesn't show up on the mobile client, pick a library, in this case form templates, get the value of whether it's hidden or not. If it's equal to false, write it to my log file, list.hidden equals true, and it hides it, and then update the object. write it back to the database. That commits to the database. So easy as that to hide a library if you want to. It's still there, still visible in SharePoint Designer, not visible from the web interface. Generally speaking, all the document libraries, all the shared documents, shared pictures, all that stuff, we don't want. $list.delete, and the list's gone.
If you had a document site collection template already,
yes.
have you done it that way? Well,
you can do it in templates. The problem with templates is that if you then suddenly want to go back and change things, when you change the template, it doesn't retrospectively change all the sites that were based on that template. So the nice thing about doing stuff in scripts is that if you want to change it, you just rerun the script and it retrospectively changes everything.
Do you do that for users? Do they get annoyed then if they suddenly were using something that...
It depends what it is. I mean, if we're updating something because we need to, then we want to go and do it. At the moment, we're thinking about, we haven't got document versioning turned on, we're about to do it. So we're going through the stage of, and the process of thinking, are we going to run a script that sets this to 5 versions every night for everybody? And if somebody sets it to 100, we put it back to 5. Or will we do it in a template where they start off at 5, and if they want to have it up at 100, they can do it, we won't put it back. So some things work well in templates, some things work well being enforced. It depends entirely on you and your users and how you want to do it.
And do you do that for just my sites or all of your site collections?
In which bit?
Well, in like you've got the my sites for the users, you've got
The everything else comes from a template. It's done once. If people want to change it, they can do so. We've got a couple of people in each department who've got permissions to change things, a sort of super contribute permission. Everybody else couldn't really change it if they wanted to, but we've got a handful of trusted people in each department who we devolve that ability to, and they can do that. Yes. Nobody is a site collection admin apart from my department, but people have got permission to change other stuff. We didn't want to, the trouble with giving people site collection admin outside of my team is that they can give that permission to other people. And what we couldn't find in 2010 is a way of saying to somebody, you can be a site collection admin, but you can't give that permission to anybody else. So we had to hide it from them entirely. And finally, change permissions. On the My Files library, which we delete and recreate because we didn't want it with a space, because if you've got URLs with spaces in, it's a pain. We changed permissions on that My Files library so it's private for the user, not applicable to everybody else in the company. Creating site collections for my department. Again, I've got a script that I wrote. I'll show it to you very briefly. It takes an XML file of site collections. Each site collection, I specify the name, I specify the URL, so it'll be my department / in this case, finance, which AD group I want to give site ownership to. It'll take 2 if you want. It produces this output when it runs. So you just run that script, it reads in this XML file, and in this particular case has produced a My Department site collection for Natasha. So I've created a content database, I've specified the team template, I've set her quota, I've set the theme, I've turned on the publishing infrastructure, I've removed the permission levels I don't want, I've created some new permission levels. I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. There wasn't any security group specified for the Natasha one, so it didn't set them. Set the root URL, hide a load of things, all done. I can repeat that as many times as I like. I can stick 500 site collections in there. It'll rebuild my entire web app in half an hour with one script. That took a week or 2 to develop that, but it's dead useful because somebody comes to me in my department, says, so-and-so wants a new My Department site collection, just like all the others. I run that script. All I've got to do is change 2 lines in the XML file, and it's all done. Well worth exploring. I'll whiz through a couple of things because I know I'm very, very close to time. We've got about 10 slides to go, so I'm going to whiz very quickly. When you talk about permissions, a permission or a permission level, if you talk about a permission level, let's say contribute or reader, those permission levels are actually particular subsets of permissions. There are 40 or so permissions, I think it's about 31 or so permissions in SharePoint. And a permission level is just a group of those. So the read permission, so that you've got 40 or so permissions, this is what they're called, there's about 40 of them, and what I do, we actually create particular custom permission levels. So in our read permission we want, and you can see how I've defined them in there. That's their official SharePoint names. So that's my read level that I want. My contribute level is read plus those, and my full control level is that plus that. And once I've created those, I can then say I'm going to create a new permission level or a role definition based on this. In this particular case, I'm creating the role.read, and I'm creating a new permission level called UOP My Department Reader. So people in my department who are members of that department, they don't get the standard read permission, the standard read permission level. They get my particular read permission level that I've defined exactly what I want, because the levels don't work exactly for the way we want them, so we completely redefine them. Sort of thing, again, that it's just worth doing. You can create managed paths databases. If you want to create a site collection in PowerShell, one line to create the managed path, one line to create the database, and you can then specify the name without GUIDs, and one line to create the site based on that, with that URL, on that template, with that database and that owner. So it's that easy to create a site collection with a GUID-less database. That's all the code that's required. Delete all the out-of-the-box permission levels. So as long as it's not full control or limited access, delete the rest. Role definition.delete whiz through them. You cannot delete the full control permission level, so it's not even worth trying. SharePoint won't let you. And that's how you hide. Again, you saw that earlier on. You can hide all the libraries you don't want. Site collection images, workflow tasks, site collection documents, we just hide them all so people can't see them. And the final topic, apologies for keeping you, but one last topic. There is a big problem with SharePoint and profile photos, user profile photos. SharePoint expects you to have all your JPEGs in one nice big list somewhere. In our particular case, we have a repository of user photos. It's in a big Oracle database, which we use for staff ID cards, student ID cards, all sorts of cashless catering purposes and all sorts of stuff. So I didn't want to have to pull in all our thousands of photos 3 times for small, medium, and large, that's what SharePoint wants, into SharePoint and then have to keep pulling them in. Could we, I wanted to find out, use those photos from the Oracle database in SharePoint without having to pull them into SharePoint? And the answer is yes, you can. Helper server, PHP, to the rescue. There is a property of every user in SharePoint called their picture URL. And if you remember from my log that I showed you when I built people's My Sites, this is an extract from it again. In the particular case of user LB718, we set her picture URL, or his picture URL, to my particular helper server, /photos, /urbphotos.php, /something JPG. SharePoint thinks that's a JPG file. SharePoint is quite happy to accept that as the photo image. It thinks that's a JPEG file at a particular URL. It's actually not. That's actually a URL to a PHP file, which has got a parameter stuck on the end of the user's username. So every time SharePoint wants to display a photo, it calls my PHP file. My PHP file looks at the end of its URL, finds out which user's photo we want, finds out whether we want small, medium, or large, pulls it from Oracle, squirts it to the user's browser. SharePoint doesn't know it came live from Oracle. That's the code that sets the user's photos to be what URL we want. So we look it up and set the picture URL to what we want. And that's the PHP code that does it. So search Oracle, where the username equals blah, 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 get the image data from Oracle. This is done in PHP. And then read the image from the data retrieved from Oracle, pass it through the GD image library, which I haven't shown you here, which is that. There's a PHP extension for doing this sort of stuff. So once you've pulled the image data from Oracle, you can resize it, you can crop it, you can stick borders around it, you can put text on it, you can do whatever you like, and then squirt it down to the browser. SharePoint thinks the pictures come from SharePoint, it's actually come live from Oracle. So if somebody goes to one of our little photo booths on campus, changes their student photo or their staff photo, 2 seconds later, it's changed in SharePoint. Easy as that. I'm not going to go through our contents directory because it's quite easy and we're very, very short of time. Incidentally, why do our photos come out as silhouettes? Because when we started doing this and pulling photos from Oracle, a handful of users said, hang on, you haven't got permission to show my photo, Data Protection Act, blah, 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 please don't do that. So we took them off, and we set up an opt-in policy. There is the other wonderful thing about pulling photos in via PHP is not only does my code pull in the information from Oracle, the first thing it does is it checks the user's LDAP entry. Has the user opted in to having their photo displayed? Because we've got a separate web page that says, do you want to opt in to having your photo displayed? If they haven't opted in, it can show the placeholder. If they have opted in, it shows the photo. You can do an awful lot more if you just don't point SharePoint at a JPEG, you point it at a code. You can then look up that, so it looks up whether they've opted in via LDAP. The green stripe means they have opted in via LDAP. This has been in test for a while, and once everyone's happy with whether they get the green stripe or not, as of next Monday when I'm back in the office, this is going live and showing real photos. At the moment, we've been in test, and the green stripe of it is a test for my code to make sure it's looking up correctly whether people are opted in or not, because they go bonkers if they haven't. Only a handful, but it's enough to annoy us. And finally, one other piece of PowerShell code, again, one of my reports that gets generated every night. For every library on the entire farm, URL, title of the library, number of items in that library, whether they've turned on versioning, and if so, how many versions. Again, 10 lines of PowerShell, I'll show you shortly. Really handy. So if you want to know whose door to go and knock on and say, did you know you've got 12,000 items in that library? You need to go and tidy it up. We need to go and knock some heads together and explain the benefits of folders and a bit more sensible archiving. We know who to go and do that to. So again, that's every library in the farm, and that's produced to an HTML file every evening. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes to run. It actually creates 3 separate HTML files, one for each web app, and that is the entire code for producing all 3 files. For each web app, so first of all, what we say is we get SP web application. We haven't specified which one to get, so it gets them all. For each web application, get every site collection. For each site collection, get every subsite. In the lists of that subsite, because a library is a list, if the object type is a document library rather than just a normal list, get its details, sort them the way we want, construct a nice date and time, dump it to HTML. Easy as that. And the file name we dump it to is that plus the web app name plus .html. So it creates our 3 separate log files, and those are our reports. And that, again, that's a very, very useful troubleshooting tool, done with PowerShell every night. I don't have to worry. I hope that gives you an idea of the power of what you can do with PowerShell as a farm admin and how you can make your life easier. Don't be tempted to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes there are some tools out there that will do it for you. I happened to come across the other day something from a little freebie from Reolinks that will dump all the security permissions for, it'll do you a great big chart of who's got permission to what in your SharePoint farm. It's a 2010 freebie. Reolinks, I don't know if they do a 2013 one. I think they're the company that produced Extradium, the extranet thing I was talking about. But there are some things out there, so Google for it first. If you can't find it, by all means write it. If you do write it, share it with the community. And anything you want to know in how to do in SharePoint and PowerShell, the first thing you Google for is what you want to do, followed by Gary Lapointe, because he's the guru about SharePoint and PowerShell. So the perception of SharePoint is that it's an out-of-the-box usable product and that it just works and it's a commodity product. You install it, you let it work, you just let the sheep wander over the field and it'll be quite happy. The reality, of course, is it's different. It's way more than the product. It's a developer's and it's a hacker's paradise. Do what you can with it. get into it, dig into it, play with PowerShell, invest 2 or 3 weeks hacking away with PowerShell. It will really pay dividends. When somebody comes to me and says, can you create me a site collection, I would normally have to say no, because it might be a couple of hours work following my lists, doing it exactly right. I just do it. It takes literally 30 seconds to do, and it whizzes away in the background, and I get things the way I want. And that really will change your life, being able to do that. It just makes things so easy. And as you can see from my other stuff, anything like JavaScript, CSS, HTML, PHP, those sort of skills are not wasted either. So apologies for being about 5 minutes over. Thank you very much for staying. Hope you've enjoyed it. I'm r.schifreen on Twitter, r.schifreen@brighton.ac.uk. You're more than welcome to get in touch if you want more information, any of the code sent to you or whatever. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks.